In the midst of the Second World War, specifically during the frigid and industrial winter of 19, a peculiar and secretive operation was underway in Rochester, New York, inside a nondescript facility known only as the Lincoln Plant. Surrounded by high-security fencing and guarded checkpoints, the Eastman Kodak Company was engaged in a manufacturing project that had absolutely nothing to do with celluloid film or family photography. To the casual observer or the uninformed neighbor, the factory was just another cog in the massive American industrial machine. However, the items rolling off these specific assembly lines were not cameras, nor were they typical munitions. They looked innocent, almost playful, resembling the quintessential sphere of American leisure, the baseball. Yet, this was a deception of the highest order. These spheres were actually T-13 Beano grenades, experimental weapons designed to detonate upon the slightest impact. The Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the precursor to the CIA and the nation's wartime intelligence agency, was convinced that this innocuous-looking ball would revolutionize infantry combat. Their logic was seduced by a beautiful simplicity. If you could weaponize the one physical action that nearly every American male had practiced since childhood, you could create a soldier who required zero additional training to become a lethal grenadier. The genesis of this project was rooted in a very real and terrifying problem facing Allied troops on the front lines. By 1943, the standard-issue American hand grenade was the Mk2, universally known as the pineapple, due to its distinct serrated castern body. While effective in its own right, the Mk2 was heavy, weighing over 21 ounces, and awkward to handle. Its shape did not lend itself to a long or accurate throw, requiring a stiff-armed lobbing motion that felt unnatural to young men raised on the fluid dynamics of a baseball pitch. More critically, the Mk2, like almost every other grenade used by major powers in the conflict, relied on a time delay fuse. Once a soldier pulled the pin and released the safety lever, or spoon, a chemical fuse would burn for 4 to 5 seconds before detonation. In theory, this allowed the thrower time to take cover. In the brutal reality of combat, however, it created a fatal vulnerability. German soldiers, particularly the battle-hardened veterans of the Eastern Front and North Africa, had developed a terrifying proficiency in counting seconds. They would watch an Allied grenade land, scoop it up, and hurl it back before the fuse ran out. Reports from the Italian campaign described Wehrmacht troops catching grenades in midair or kicking them back into American foxholes. The safety mechanism designed to protect the thrower was effectively being weaponized against him. To counter this, the Allied forces needed a grenade that offered the enemy no quarter and no time to react. They needed an impact fuse mechanism that would trigger an explosion the instant the weapon struck a solid object, whether that was the ground, a tank, or an enemy soldier. If a grenade exploded on contact, there would be no counting down, no brave return throws, and no escape. However, creating a stable impact fuse for a handheld device had plagued military engineers for decades. The physics presented a cruel paradox. A mechanism sensitive enough to explode when it hit the mud of a battlefield was also likely sensitive enough to explode if a soldier tripped, dropped his pack, or jostled the grenade against his rifle stock. The British had abandoned the idea, sticking with their reliable time-fused Mills bomb. The Americans, however, driven by the unorthodox thinking of the OSS, believed they could engineer a solution. The concept for the T-13 is largely attributed to Colonel Carl Eifler, the commander of OSS Detachment 101, who operated deep behind enemy lines in Burma. Eifler looked at his men and saw a generation raised on the baseball diamond. He noted that the throwing motion of a pitcher was instinctive, deeply ingrained in muscle memory, and capable of generating tremendous velocity and accuracy. A trained pitcher could hurl a ball at over 90 miles per hour. Even an average recruit could accurately hit a target at 60 yards. Eifler posed the question to his superiors: why force American boys to learn an awkward lob when they already possessed a lethal skill? If the grenade felt like a baseball, weighed like a baseball, and flew like a baseball, the American infantryman would instantly become the most dangerous grenadier in history. The idea quickly reached the desk of Stanley P. Lovell, the head of the OSS Research and Development Branch. Lovell, known affectionately and somewhat ominously as Professor Moriarty for his devious inventions, which included silent pistols and explosive cold, championed the project immediately. It fit perfectly with the OSS ethos of asymmetric warfare and psychological advantage. The specifications laid out for the new weapon were exacting. To leverage the soldier's muscle memory, the grenade had to mimic a regulation baseball in every dimension. It required a circumference of 9 inches and a weight of roughly 5.5 ounces. It needed to be perfectly spherical and balanced. Crucially, it had to detonate upon striking any surface, regardless of the angle of impact. Eastman Kodak was selected as the prime contractor not just for their manufacturing capacity, but for their expertise in precision mechanics and small component assembly. The company converted the Lincoln plant to meet the classified demands, stamping the experimental grenades with EKC for Eastman Kodak Company. However, as soon as the engineers began the practical work of translation from concept to reality, the laws of physics intervened. The primary hurdle was weight. A standard baseball is a core of cork and rubber wrapped in yarn and leather. A grenade, by necessity, requires a heavy steel casing to create fragmentation and a dense core of high explosives to generate lethality. Trying to pack a lethal amount of ordnance and a complex fuse mechanism into a 5.5-ounce package proved impossible. As development progressed, the weight of the T-13 ballooned. The final production models weighed approximately 12 ounces more than double the weight of a regulation baseball. While this was still significantly lighter than the 21-ounce Mk2 Pineapple, it fundamentally altered the ballistics. The instinctive throw that the OSS was banking on was compromised. Throwing a 12-ounce steel ball required different force and release points than throwing a 5-ounce leather ball. Despite this, the engineers pressed on, utilizing a potent explosive filler known as Composition A, an RDX-based mix that was far more powerful per ounce than standard TNT to compensate for the smaller size. The steel shell was made thin, just 1 millimeter thick, designed to shatter into hundreds of high-velocity fragments. The heart of the T-13, and ultimately its tragic flaw, was the T-5 impact fuse. This mechanism was a marvel of complexity designed to solve the safety paradox. The grenade featured a weighted butterfly cap that sat on top of the sphere. The soldier would grip the grenade with 2 fingers over this cap, mimicking the grip on a baseball's seams. A safety pin held the cap in place. Once the pin was pulled and the grenade was thrown, the air resistance and centrifugal force would cause the cap to fly off. This cap was attached to a length of nylon cord. As the grenade flew through the air, the cap would unwind the cord, which in turn pulled a secondary arming pin out of the fuse inside the grenade body. This meant the grenade would only become live after it had traveled a safe distance from the thrower. Once armed, a spring-loaded striker was held back only by a delicate trigger mechanism that would release upon any impact, detonating the explosive. On paper, the design was brilliant. It theoretically prevented the grenade from exploding. If dropped at the soldier's feet because the cord wouldn't have time to unwind and arm the device, it also ensured that once thrown, it would explode on contact. In practice, however, the mechanism was a disaster. The line between sensitive enough to kill the enemy and too sensitive for safety proved impossible to walk. Early testing at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in late 1943 revealed terrifying instability. Grenades were detonating when dropped from heights as low as 6 inches, utterly failing the safety requirements. Soldiers and testers began to fear the weapon. 3 men were wounded in early handling drills when units detonated unexpectedly. The specific motion required to arm the grenade, the separation of the butterfly cap, was also prone to user error. If a soldier's grip slipped, or if the cap snagged during the wind-up, the cord could jerk the arming pin free while the explosive was still in the thrower's hand. The tragedy that should have ended the program occurred on November 3, 1944. A civilian tester at the proving grounds, attempting to verify the arming distance of the fuse, threw a T-13 straight up into the air. The physics of the vertical throw caused the arming mechanism to engage fully on the ascent. When the grenade came back down, it struck the tester on the head. Because it was an impact grenade, it did exactly what it was designed to do. It detonated instantly. The man was killed immediately. Despite this horrific accident, the pressure of the war, specifically the looming invasion of Germany and the intense combat in the Pacific, pushed the army to continue. They believed the tactical advantage of an impact grenade was worth the developmental risks. Engineers scrambled to modify the fuse, creating the T5E1 and T5E2 variants, attempting to desensitize the trigger while maintaining reliability. By early 1945, with the war in Europe entering its final, bloody phase, the Army shipped approximately 10,000 of these modified grenades to the European theater for field trials. If the domestic testing had been dangerous, the field trials were a catastrophe. The intricate mechanical fuse, filled with small springs and sliding parts, was ill-suited for the mud, snow, and freezing temperatures of the European winter. Soldiers found that the cold thickened the lubricants and froze the mechanisms. When thrown, a staggering number of the grenades, roughly 10%, failed to detonate at all. They would land in the snow with a dull thud, becoming unexploded ordnance that posed a threat to any soldier who later stepped on them. The soldiers lost faith in the weapon immediately. A grenade that doesn't explode is worse than useless. It is a liability. However, duds were preferable to the alternative. The most damning failures occurred when the grenades worked too well. During the field trials, reports filtered back of premature detonations. These were not impact explosions, but blasts that occurred in mid-air, or horrifyingly, immediately upon leaving the thrower's hand. The erratic behavior of the nylon cord arming system meant that under certain conditions, the grenade could arm itself instantly. Official ordnance records from the trials documented that 5 separate premature detonations resulted in 2 American deaths and 44 injuries. The weapon that was designed to save American lives by eliminating the throwback risk was instead killing its own operators. The troops nicknamed it the Beano, a moniker that sounded harmless but became synonymous with unpredictable danger. The contrast between the American innovation and the solutions found by other nations is stark. The Germans, facing the same desire for range and safety, utilized the stick grenade-style hand grenade by attaching a hollow wooden handle to the explosive head. They utilized simple leverage to allow soldiers to throw the grenade further, without needing to reinvent the fuse mechanism or change the weight of the explosive. It was a low-tech solution that relied on basic physics rather than complex engineering. The British simply accepted the limitations of the time delay fuse and trained their men to cook off the grenade, holding it for 1 or 2 seconds after, releasing the lever to shorten the time the enemy had to react. It was a dangerous practice, but it was predictable. The Beano was neither simple nor predictable. It was a case of over-engineering where the desire for a technologically perfect solution blinded the developers to the realities of mechanical failure and battlefield chaos. On March 22, 1945, General Joseph Stilwell, having seen the casualty reports and the abysmal performance data from the field, ordered an immediate halt to all testing. The order was definitive. 7 days later, production at the Eastman Kodak plant was suspended. By June, with the Nazis defeated and the focus shifting entirely to Japan, the final directive was issued. The project was classified as obsolete, and all existing stocks of the T-13 grenade were to be destroyed. The warehouses full of the deadly baseballs were cleared out, and the devices were demolished. The files were archived, and the T-13 became a footnote in the massive encyclopedia of World War II weaponry. The T-13 holds the grim and dubious distinction in military history of being one of the few weapons to have inflicted more confirmed casualties on the forces developing it than on the enemy it was intended to defeat. While there are vague, unverified rumors of limited use during the Normandy campaign, extensive post-war analysis has never produced a single confirmed report of a German soldier being killed by a Beano grenade. The failure of the Beano was not a failure of concept, but of timing. The idea was sound. In modern warfare, impact grenades are common and effective. Today, however, they utilize electronic accelerometers and sophisticated sensors that can distinguish the acceleration profile of a throw from the shock of a drop, ensuring safety in a way that mechanical springs and pins never could. The OSS and Kodak were trying to build a 21st century weapon with 1940s technology. They were trying to solve a complex dynamic problem with nylon cords and sliding metal latches. The genius idea capitalizing on the American love for baseball, them to the mechanical impossibility of the task at hand. Today, very few examples of the T-13 survive. They are rare collector's items, occasionally surfacing in museums like the JFK Special Warfare Museum at Fort Liberty or the Spygate Museum in New York, often changing hands for thousands of dollars. They sit behind glass, looking for all the world like heavy steel baseballs, innocuous to the untrained eye. But to those who know the history, they represent a cautionary tale of innovation gone wrong. They are a reminder of the frantic, desperate creativity of the war years, where camera companies built grenades and spies designed weapons based on sports. The legacy of the Beano is a tragic irony, a weapon shaped to fit the hand of every American boy, which ultimately bit the hand that threw it. The logic was bulletproof. The cultural connection was brilliant, but the grenade itself was a catastrophe, proving that in the unforgiving arena of war, a clever idea is nothing without the technology to make it work.